Okay, so we just covered laser. Now we're going to be talking about the illumination unit. And we've got a couple of different topics, subtopics in this area. We've got its relationship to CD imaging. We'll talk a little bit about polarization control, illumination, INA. This is an important topic, concept to kind of understand. Some theory behind it, some creation methods. And then some comments about reticle illumination, talking about the blinds and the variable slit, and then some brief comments here about the illumination condition manager, which helps manage illumination conditions through software. Okay, so basically the illumination unit serves two major purposes, basically optimizing the polarization state and optimizing the INA, or illumination numerical aperture, which you can kind of understand as the extent of the source or the source shape, that kind of idea. These both impact resolution and depth of focus, which we'll discuss in a later slide. In order to achieve uniform illumination of the reticle, we've got the ARB. These are the blinds, which is the blinds plus the variable slit. And here we're just showing a depiction out of the CBT. As we had mentioned previously, resolution and depth of focus enhancement provided by the IU, it's represented in the K factors in these very basic imaging equations. Okay, so here's a brief slide about polarization. Essentially, it's describing the oscillation of the electric field. That's typically how we describe it. The Cymer laser, it provides linearly polarized light to the IU, to the scanner IU. And then the IU essentially alters the polarization state to either depolarized light or some form of linearly polarized light. Okay, here we're just showing just a depiction of linear, elliptical, circular, and depolarized. So the polarization state is actually selected and or optimized on a layer or reticle basis. And it has a lot to do with the pattern type that is being exposed. And so, just showing in this simple simulation, if you are trying to image a vertical pattern on the reticle, if you use unpolarized light or horizontally polarized light, you can see that the aerial image, the optical intensity is not very strong. It's actually degraded. And you can kind of see it here also in these images. And what you really want to be doing, and this is what a customer will typically do, is use polarization that is appropriate to the types of structures that they're printing. So here, printing a vertical structure using vertical polarized light gives you the best kind of image contrast. There's a couple of different subsystems within the IU that are used for polarization control. Here's a schematic out of the 63X CBT. And we've identified the key items, which we talk about on the next slide. So we've got a half-wave plate. This is always in the illumination path. And we typically rotate it to minimize circular polarization error. Okay, that's its function. Also in the IU path is a half-wave plate. And this is to adjust the linear polarization angle. So these two together are used to kind of optimize the polarization. We also have a partial depolarizer. This is only inserted into the IU path when a depolarized light is used. I think Intel has maybe one depolarized ID that they're using, although polarized light does give you better contrast. And so I think they're even moving away from that to basically just using all polarized IDs. Just FYI. So these are kind of the key components. In addition to that, we've got an azimuthal turret. It's a turret that can have these optical elements, which we call azimuthal elements. And here is just a depiction of azimuthal element generations. So when we started off, we had a very kind of discrete, an element that had components that could manipulate the polarization in very discrete components and very discrete areas in the plane, in the pupil plane. And we have gone from something this discrete to more and more continuous. And essentially what we're using now, I think maybe from 1272 process onward, is a continuous azimuthal element where the angle of the polarization is continuously varying to essentially mirror the kinds of structures that are printed by the customer. So it's a turret. We have elements in there. It rotates for depending on whether the ID uses azimuthal polarization or not. It will rotate into the path when it's using that particular illumination condition. It's just basic. Here is a view through the illumination condition manager of a particular illumination condition. And so essentially it's managed as a file that contains information about offsets, settings for the illumination, for the IU itself, and also including, for instance, laser parameters and things like that, and also projection lens items. But it's how Nikon collects and organizes all of the information about a particular ID. So this is for the older, this is pre-6.3x platform. For 6.3x, we have this plus additional files, which you guys may have talked a little bit about in your 6.3x IIU. Okay. But anyways, the main takeaway here is that it's essentially managed. It's got selectable settings so that the user can configure them, and they are customized per ID, and they represent settings and offsets specific to that ID. And as it relates to polarization, obviously we have settings within IU parameter here where we can designate the polarization status, whether that particular illumination ID is depolarized, VH, azimuthally, etc. Okay, so here's kind of where it would be designated, and based on that designation, when the scanner goes to use the ID, that it knows which components need to drive within the path and how it needs to configure it so that it's being used properly. Here's another key concept, illumination numerical aperture. It's essentially, as I mentioned, the extent of the source. It's expressed in terms of the incident angle, here theta I, of the light source onto the reticle. And it can be thought of as a group of many individual point light sources, which is going to be relevant for some of the later slides that are coming up. Okay. So how does the INA actually impact the imaging? So as I said, the INA is essentially related to this incident angle component here in this diffraction schematic. And this is just kind of a reminder of that. So INA here is represented as seen from looking down toward the reticle, is seen as this particular angle. INA is the sine of that angle. That's typically how it's represented. And similarly, looking up toward the lens NA, we see that the lens numerical aperture it's got a kind of corresponding definition. It's this angle here. And so essentially we use this